The sun was just beginning to rise over the New York skyline as a man in his late 30s made his way through the bustling airport. Dressed in a tailored suit, carrying a leather bag, and exuding an air of confidence, he looked every bit like someone who had spent years perfecting the art of debate. His name wasn't important. What mattered was how he carried himself. He believed strongly in progress, equality, and challenging outdated norms. To him, anything rooted in tradition often felt like a relic from another time, something that needed to be questioned or even mocked if it stood in the way of progress. This man had just wrapped up a high-profile conference where he'd delivered a speech on modern values. The applause still echoed in his mind, fueling his sense of superiority. As he boarded the first-class section of the flight to Los Angeles, he couldn't help but feel smug about his intellectual prowess. Everything seemed to align perfectly with his worldview, until he noticed the woman sitting next to him. She looked calm, unassuming, and kind. Her presence didn't scream for attention, but there was one detail about her that caught his eye: a small silver cross hanging around her neck. It glinted faintly under the soft cabin lights, almost as if daring him to say something. At first, he dismissed it. People wore jewelry all the time. It wasn't unusual. But the more he glanced at it, the more it gnawed at him. To him, symbols like that represented everything he opposed: dogma, rigidity, and outdated beliefs. Feeling emboldened by the success of his recent talk, he decided to strike up a conversation, not because he wanted to understand her perspective, but because he saw an opportunity to assert his own. "Interesting choice of accessory," he said casually, gesturing toward the cross. His tone was light, but there was a hint of condescension behind it. The woman turned to face him, her expression warm and open. She didn't seem offended or defensive, which surprised him slightly. "Thank you," she replied softly. "It means a lot to me." Her voice carried a quiet strength, but instead of curiosity, it sparked irritation within him. How could anyone value something so archaic? He leaned back in his seat, crossing one leg over the other, ready to deliver what he thought would be a clever critique. "You know," he began, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "symbols like that have caused a lot of trouble throughout history. Wars, oppression, fear-mongering. It's all tied to stuff like that necklace." He paused, waiting for her reaction, expecting some form of defensiveness or awkwardness. Instead, she simply nodded. "You're right," she said calmly. "Religion has been misused in terrible ways, but not everything tied to faith is harmful." Her words were measured, thoughtful, and completely unexpected. For a moment he faltered, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't anticipated such composure, or worse, agreement, from someone wearing a symbol he assumed she'd blindly defend. Unwilling to let go of his point, he pressed on. "But isn't it all based on myths? Stories passed down to control people?" He raised an eyebrow, confident in his argument. This was familiar territory for him. He'd dismantled similar ideas countless times before, yet this time felt different. There was something about her demeanor that unsettled him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled faintly, as if she understood something he didn't. "I can see why you'd think that," she said. "But for me, this cross isn't about control or myths. It's a reminder of love, hope, and grace. Those aren't bad things, are they?" Her response threw him off balance. Love, hope, and grace? These were concepts he prided himself on advocating for. Yet here she was, framing them through a lens he'd dismissed without a second thought. He opened his mouth to argue further, but hesitated. Something in her tone, calm, sincere and devoid of hostility, made it hard for him to continue. For the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning his assumptions. Why did he feel the need to mock her belief system? Was it really about challenging outdated ideas, or was it more about proving himself right? These questions lingered in his mind as the plane prepared for takeoff, the hum of the engines filling the silence between them. As the aircraft climbed higher into the sky, the man realized this conversation was far from over. Little did he know, this seemingly casual exchange would challenge not only his beliefs, but also the very foundation of how he viewed the world and himself. The plane leveled off and the faint hum of the engines filled the cabin. The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence wavering. He had expected a defensive reaction, maybe even an argument, but her calm demeanor left him, unsure of how to proceed. For someone who prided himself on being quick-witted and articulate, this was unfamiliar territory. Still, he wasn't ready to let go of his point just yet. He cleared his throat, leaning forward slightly as if to emphasize the importance of what he was about to say. "Look," he began, his tone firmer now. "I get that you find meaning in it, but isn't it all just wishful thinking? People clinging to something because they're afraid of uncertainty or death?" His words hung in the air, sharp and pointed, but they didn't seem to faze her. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with a curious expression, as if trying to understand where his passion stemmed from. "You sound like you've thought a lot about this," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. It wasn't a challenge, it was more like an observation, and somehow that made him feel even more exposed. He nodded, perhaps a little too eagerly. "Of course I have," he replied. "It's important to question things, to not blindly accept ideas just because they've been around for centuries." She smiled faintly, nodding in agreement. "I agree with you there. Questioning is good. It helps us grow. But sometimes, when we question, we also miss the bigger picture." Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight that made him pause. What did she mean by the bigger picture? Wasn't he the one advocating for progress and clarity before he could ask? She continued. "Take love, for example. You mentioned fear of death and uncertainty. But what if faith, or hope, or whatever you want to call it, isn't just about avoiding those fears? What if it's about finding strength to face them, to keep going even when life gets hard?" Her question caught him off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He wanted to argue, to explain why her perspective was flawed, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she spoke, not with arrogance or superiority, but with genuine curiosity and kindness. Or maybe it was the fact that her words resonated with him in a way he hadn't anticipated. After all, hadn't he spent years championing empathy and understanding? Why did it feel so different when the tables were turned? Determined to regain control of the conversation, he steered it back to familiar ground. "But don't you think it's dangerous to base your entire worldview on something that can't be proven? Science gives us facts, concrete evidence. Faith doesn't offer that kind of certainty." To his surprise, she didn't recoil or argue. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, thoughtful. "Science is beautiful," she said after a moment. "It explains so much about the world, but science answers what things are and how they work. Faith, for me, answers why. Not in a literal sense, but in a way that gives purpose. They don't have to contradict each other." Her response left him speechless. He had always viewed science and faith as opposing forces, locked in an eternal battle for dominance. Yet, here she was suggesting they could coexist peacefully. The idea was foreign to him, almost radical. How could someone hold two seemingly contradictory beliefs without feeling torn apart by doubt? Sensing his confusion, she added gently, "Think about it this way. When people lose loved ones, science tells us why their bodies stop functioning. But faith, or hope, or whatever you choose to call it, helps them grieve, heal, and find meaning in the loss. Both play a role in how we navigate life." Her analogy struck a chord deep within him. He thought about his own experiences, the times he'd felt lost, searching for answers that no amount of logic or reason could provide. Had he ever allowed himself to consider the possibility that there might be value in something beyond empirical proof? No, he realized. He'd dismissed it outright, labeling it as irrational or outdated. As the flight attendants moved through the aisle offering drinks, he ordered a coffee, hoping the caffeine would sharpen his thoughts. She declined politely, opting for water instead. Watching her sip from the plastic cup, he noticed something he hadn't before. A quiet contentment in her demeanor. There was no need to prove herself, no urgency to convince him of anything. She simply existed in the moment, grounded and at peace. This realization unnerved him. In his quest to dismantle her beliefs, he had unwittingly revealed his own insecurities. He thrived on debates, on proving others wrong, because it validated his intelligence and worldview. But here, sitting beside this woman who radiated calmness and conviction, he felt stripped bare. All his arguments, all his rehearsed lines seemed hollow in comparison to her authenticity. So, he ventured cautiously, breaking the silence. "You're saying faith isn't about blind obedience? That it's more personal than that?" He hated how uncertain he sounded, how vulnerable his voice betrayed him to be. She nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Exactly. For me, it's about connection. To something greater, yes, but also to the people around me. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone, even when it's hard." Her words lingered in the air between them, heavy with meaning. He glanced out the window, watching the endless expanse of clouds stretch beneath them. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of doubt, not about her beliefs, but about his own. Could it be possible that he'd been so focused on tearing down walls that he'd failed to see the bridges others were building? As the plane cruised onward, he found himself grappling with questions he hadn't asked in years. Questions about purpose, identity, and the spaces where logic and emotion intersected. This stranger, with her quiet wisdom and unshakable grace, had planted seeds of reflection in his mind, and he wasn't sure he was ready to confront what they might grow into. The man stared out the window, his coffee growing cold in its cup. The clouds below stretched endlessly, a sea of white that seemed to mirror the emptiness he suddenly felt inside. He had always prided himself on being rational, on seeing the world through a lens of logic and evidence. But now, sitting next to this woman who radiated calmness and conviction, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was missing something vital. He turned back toward her, his brow furrowed. "You keep talking about connection," he said slowly, as if testing the weight of the word. "But isn't that just abstract? A nice idea, sure, but how does it actually help people in real life?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved deftly across the screen, scrolling through photos before handing it to him. "Here," she said simply. On the screen were images of smiling children, volunteers handing out meals, handwritten thank you notes pinned to a bulletin board. There were snapshots of classrooms filled with eager faces, community gardens bursting with fresh produce, and groups of people laughing together under makeshift tents. "This is what connection looks like for me," she explained. "I run a nonprofit focused on education and mentorship. We work with kids who've been overlooked by the system, kids who need someone to believe in them. My faith reminds me why I do it, even when it's hard." He scrolled through the photos, his skepticism softening with each image. These weren't stock photos or staged moments. They were raw, genuine glimpses of humanity at its best. He could see the joy in the children's eyes, the gratitude in the volunteers' smiles. It wasn't about religion, not directly anyway. It was about service, about showing up day after day for people who needed help. "I didn't realize," he began, trailing off. He handed the phone back to her, feeling oddly unsettled. He'd spent so much time debating ideas, dissecting beliefs and critiquing systems that he hadn't stopped to consider the tangible impact of those beliefs. To him, concepts like faith and hope had always seemed intangible, almost irrelevant in the face of real-world problems. Yet here was proof that they could inspire action, that they could drive people to make a difference. She smiled gently, sensing his shift in perspective. "It's not about perfection," she said. "I mess up all the time. But my faith gives me a reason to try again, to keep going even when things feel impossible. It's not about having all the answers. It's about trusting that there's still good worth fighting for." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Trust. That was something he realized he'd been lacking, not just in others, but in himself. He trusted data, facts, and arguments because they were concrete, predictable. But trust in something unseen, in the possibility of goodness despite the chaos, that felt risky, almost foolish. And yet, looking at her now, he couldn't deny the strength it gave her. He leaned back in his seat, rubbing his temples. "I guess I've always seen faith as a crutch," he admitted quietly. "Something people lean on, because they can't handle reality. But you're not like that at all. You're doing things, real things that matter." She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "A lot of people think that way. They assume faith makes you passive or naive. But for me, it's the opposite. It pushes me to act, to care, to show up where I'm needed most. It doesn't mean ignoring the problems of the world. It means rolling up your sleeves and trying to fix them." He nodded, absorbing her words. For the first time, he allowed himself to entertain the idea that faith, or whatever you wanted to call it, wasn't inherently bad. Maybe it wasn't about blind obedience or clinging to outdated traditions. Maybe it was about finding purpose in a chaotic world, about believing in something bigger than yourself, even if you couldn't fully explain it. As the flight attendants passed by offering snacks, he declined absently, lost in thought. This conversation had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. What started as an attempt to mock her beliefs had become a mirror reflecting his own insecurities. He had mocked her cross, assuming it represented everything he opposed. But now, he saw it differently. It wasn't a symbol of oppression or ignorance, it was a reminder of love, hope, and resilience. And perhaps deep down, those were things he valued too. "You know," he said, finally breaking the silence, "I came into this thinking I was going to change your mind, but somehow you've made me question mine." He laughed nervously, scratching the back of his neck. "That's not something I'm used to." She grinned, her expression warm and understanding. "Growth happens when we step outside our comfort zones," she said. "I don't expect you to agree with me or even understand everything I believe, but I hope you'll keep asking questions. That's how we learn." Her response disarmed him completely. There was no judgment, no pressure to conform, just an invitation to explore, to seek truth without fear of being wrong. It was a refreshing change from the debates he was accustomed to, where winning was everything and vulnerability was seen as weakness. As the plane cruised steadily westward, he found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't expected. The tension that had gripped him earlier melted away, replaced by a quiet curiosity. For years he had built walls around his beliefs, fortifying them with logic and reason. But now, sitting beside this stranger who embodied grace and authenticity, he realized those walls might have been keeping him from truly connecting with others, and with himself. The clouds outside began to thin, revealing patches of blue sky. He glanced at her again, noticing the subtle glow of contentment on her face. She wasn't trying to convert him, convince him, or prove him wrong. She simply existed in her truth, unapologetically and beautifully. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was room for both their worlds to coexist. The man sat quietly, staring at the seat back in front of him as if it held the answers to questions he hadn't fully formed yet. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one colliding with the next. He had always prided himself on being the smartest person in the room, the one who could dismantle any argument with logic and wit. But now, for the first time in years, he felt unsure, uncertain not just about what she believed, but about what he believed. He glanced over at her again, noticing how effortlessly she seemed to carry herself. There was no pretense, no need to prove anything. She simply existed in her truth, radiating a quiet confidence that came from knowing who she was and what she stood for. It made him uncomfortable, not because it threatened his worldview, but because it highlighted the cracks in his own armor. He realized with growing unease that his arguments often stemmed less from conviction and more from a desperate need to feel superior. "You're different," he said abruptly, breaking the silence. The words tumbled out before he could stop them, raw and unfiltered. I mean, you're not like other people I've talked to about this stuff. She raised an eyebrow, amused but intrigued. Different how? He hesitated, searching for the right words. Most people get defensive when I bring up religion, or they try to convince me I'm wrong. You haven't done either. You've just listened and shared your perspective without making me feel stupid. Her smile widened slightly, softening the lines around her eyes. Well, I figure everyone's on their own journey, she replied. My job isn't to change your mind. It's to live my life in a way that reflects what I believe. If that sparks a conversation, great. If not, that's okay too. Her response hit him like a punch to the gut, not because it was harsh, but because it was so disarmingly simple. She wasn't playing games or trying to win some invisible battle. She was just being authentic, something he realized he rarely allowed himself to do. In his quest to appear intelligent and progressive, he had built walls around his emotions, hiding behind facts and theories instead of embracing the messy, beautiful complexity of human experience. I think I've been doing it wrong, he admitted softly, surprising even himself. I thought being open-minded meant tearing down other people's beliefs. But maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's about listening, really listening, without feeling like I have to fix everything. She nodded slowly, encouraging him to continue. That takes courage, she said. It's hard to sit with uncertainty, to let go of the need to control every outcome. But sometimes, the most meaningful growth happens when we step back and make space for others. Her words resonated deeply, stirring something inside him that he couldn't quite name. For years, he had equated strength with certainty, with having all the answers and never backing down. But sitting here now, surrounded by strangers on a plane hurtling through the sky, he realized that true strength lay in vulnerability. It took guts to admit you didn't know everything, to acknowledge that someone else's perspective might hold value, even if it challenged your own. As the flight attendants began preparing the cabin for landing, the man leaned forward, resting, his elbows on his knees. Can I ask you something? He said, his voice tinged with hesitation. Do you ever doubt? Like, do you ever question whether what you believe is real? She tilted her head, considering his question carefully. Of course I do, she said finally. Doubt is part of the process. It keeps us humble, reminds us that we're human. But doubt doesn't scare me anymore, because even when I don't have all the answers, I still see the impact of what I believe in the lives of the kids I work with, in the communities we serve, in the connections we build. Her honesty caught him off guard. He had expected platitudes, vague reassurances designed to smooth over tough questions. Instead, she met him where he was, acknowledging the messiness of faith without shying away from it. It was refreshing and humbling. I envy that, he confessed. I wish I could believe in something so wholeheartedly, but I don't know if I can. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. You don't have to rush into anything, she said. Faith isn't a destination, it's a journey. Start small. Ask questions. Be open to learning. That's all anyone can do. Her touch lingered for a moment, warm and reassuring, before she pulled away. The gesture was simple, yet it carried a weight that left him speechless. In that brief moment, he felt seen, not as an opponent to be debated, but as a person struggling to find meaning in a chaotic world. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into Los Angeles. Outside the window, the city sprawled beneath them, its streets glittering like veins of gold under the late afternoon sun. The man gazed at it absently, his thoughts swirling like the clouds they were leaving behind. This trip had started as just another leg of his busy schedule, a routine flight between cities, but somewhere along the way it had become something more, a turning point perhaps in how he viewed the world and his place within it. What happens next? He asked suddenly, turning to face her. After we land, I mean. Do we just go, our separate ways? She smiled, her expression thoughtful. That's up to you, she said. We could exchange numbers, stay in touch. or we could part ways here and now. Either way, I'm glad we had this conversation." He nodded, feeling a pang of reluctance at the thought of saying goodbye. For all his initial skepticism, he had come to appreciate her presence, the calmness she brought to their exchange, the wisdom she offered without judgment. She had challenged him in ways he hadn't anticipated, forcing him to confront parts of himself he'd long ignored. "Let's stay in touch," he said finally, pulling out his phone. She did the same, and they exchanged numbers quickly, the act feeling oddly intimate despite its simplicity. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, he found himself reluctant to leave his seat. He wanted to keep talking, to dive deeper into the questions she had stirred within him, but he knew their time together was coming to an end. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, she stood, gathering her belongings with practiced ease. He followed suit, shouldering his bag and stepping into the aisle beside her. They walked together, toward the exit, the hum of the engines fading into the background as they joined the stream of passengers disembarking. At the jet bridge, she paused, turning to face him one last time. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere, "for listening, for being willing to engage even when it wasn't easy." He swallowed hard, nodding. "No, thank you," he replied, "for reminding me that there's more to life than winning arguments." With that, she smiled, gave a small wave, and disappeared into the crowd. He stood there for a moment, watching her go, before heading in the opposite direction. As he stepped into the bustling terminal, he felt lighter somehow, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. The cross she wore, once a symbol of everything he opposed, now represented something else entirely: the power of connection, of grace, and of opening your heart to new possibilities. As the man stepped into the bustling terminal, the noise of rolling suitcases, distant announcements, and hurried footsteps filled his ears. The airport was alive with movement, a chaotic symphony of people rushing to their next destinations. Yet, despite the chaos around him, he felt strangely still inside, as if the world had slowed down just for him. His mind replayed fragments of the conversation he'd just had, each word echoing like a ripple across water. He couldn't remember the last time someone had challenged his beliefs so gently yet profoundly. He wandered toward the baggage claim area, his steps slow and deliberate. Normally, he would have been glued to his phone, scrolling through emails or checking social media to pass the time. But today, he kept it tucked away in his pocket, choosing instead to let his thoughts roam, free. What was it about that woman that had left such an impression on him? Was it her calm demeanor? Her willingness to listen without judgment? Or was it something deeper, something he hadn't fully grasped yet? He reached the carousel and leaned against the railing, watching as luggage tumbled onto the rotating belt. Around him, travelers jostled for position, scanning the conveyor for their bags. Some looked impatient, others distracted, but none seemed to notice the quiet moment unfolding within him. For years he had worn his skepticism like armor, using it to shield himself from anything he deemed irrational or outdated. But now, standing there amidst strangers, he realized how heavy that armor had become. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. A childhood Sunday spent sitting in a pew while sunlight streamed through stained glass windows. He remembered the way the colors danced on the floor, creating patterns that shifted with every passing cloud. Back then, faith had felt magical, almost tangible. Somewhere along the way, though, he had dismissed those feelings as childish fantasies, replacing them with cold logic and rigid ideologies. Had he thrown out the baby with the bathwater? Had he abandoned not just religion, but also the sense of wonder and connection it once inspired? The sound of his suitcase clattering onto the carousel snapped him back to the present. He grabbed it and headed toward the exit, weaving through the crowd with mechanical precision. Outside, the warm California air enveloped him, carrying with the faint scent of jet fuel and palm trees. He paused for a moment, taking it all in. The hum of idling taxis, the chatter of tourists, the endless stream of humanity flowing past him. It struck him then. Life wasn't meant to be dissected or debated into submission. It was messy, unpredictable, and beautiful, and maybe, just maybe, that was okay. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his reverie. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen, half expecting a work email or some trivial notification. Instead, he saw a text from the woman he'd met on the plane. It was short and simple, but it carried a weight that made him smile. "Hope you made it out okay. Remember what we talked about. Keep asking questions." Her words lingered in his mind, sparking a mix of emotions he couldn't quite untangle. Gratitude, curiosity, and a hint of vulnerability swirled together, leaving him feeling both exposed and invigorated. He typed out a quick reply. "Thanks for everything, I'll try." As he hit send, he realized he meant it. For the first time in years, he wanted to lean into the discomfort of uncertainty rather than run from it. He didn't know where this newfound openness would lead, or if it would even last, but he was willing to give it a shot. After all, wasn't that what she had been saying all along? That growth came not from having all the answers, but from embracing the questions? He flagged down a taxi and climbed inside, giving the driver the address of his hotel. As the car merged into traffic, he gazed out the window, watching the city unfold before him. Los Angeles was a place of contrasts. Gleaming skyscrapers towering over weathered neighborhoods, luxury cars sharing the road with battered trucks. It was imperfect, unpredictable, and alive in ways that mirrored his own internal landscape. Maybe that's why he loved visiting. It reminded him that beauty often existed in the spaces between order and chaos. The taxi ride gave him time to reflect further. He thought about the debates he'd had over the years, the countless arguments, won and lost. He prided himself on being articulate, on dismantling opposing viewpoints with surgical precision. But now he wondered if he'd been missing the point entirely. Winning wasn't the same as understanding. Convincing someone they were wrong didn't mean you'd truly connected with them. And sometimes, the most meaningful conversations weren't about changing minds. They were about opening hearts. By the time the taxi pulled up to his hotel, he felt lighter, as if a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying had begun to lift. He tipped the driver generously and stepped out onto the sidewalk, dragging his suitcase behind him. The lobby was sleek and modern, a stark contrast to the cluttered thoughts still swirling in his head. He checked in quickly, eager to retreat to his room and process everything that had happened. Once inside, he dropped his bag by the door and flopped onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. He closed his eyes, letting the events of the day wash over him. He thought about her cross, the symbol that had initially sparked his mockery. Now, it represented something entirely different: resilience, grace, and the power of belief to inspire action. It wasn't the object itself that mattered. It was the meaning behind it. For years, he had equated faith with weakness, assuming it was a crutch for those unable to face reality. But now he saw it differently. Faith wasn't about denying the world's problems. It was about finding strength to confront them. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about trusting that even in the absence of certainty, there was still good worth fighting for. And perhaps most importantly, it wasn't about isolating yourself from others. It was about connecting, serving, and showing up where you were needed most. He sat up, grabbing a notebook from his bag. Flipping it open, he began jotting down notes, not polished arguments or rebuttals, but raw, unfiltered thoughts. Questions he wanted to explore, ideas he wanted to revisit, lessons he hoped to carry forward. Writing helped him make sense of things, turning abstract feelings into something concrete. By the time he finished, several pages were filled with scribbles and sketches, each one a testament to the journey he had only just begun. As evening fell, he ordered room service and settled in for the night. The city lights twinkled beyond the window, casting a soft glow across the room. He picked up his phone again, rereading her text. "Keep asking questions." Those 4 words stayed with him, lingering like a promise. Tomorrow, he would step back into his busy life, resuming the roles of speaker, thinker, and advocate. But tonight he allowed himself to simply be a man who had been changed, however slightly, by a chance encounter on a plane. And as he drifted off to sleep, he couldn't help but wonder, What other lessons awaited him in the unlikeliest of places? The next morning, the man woke up earlier than usual. The room was bathed in soft sunlight streaming through the blinds, painting stripes across the carpet. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, his mind already buzzing with thoughts of the previous day. It wasn't just the conversation that lingered. It was the shift he felt within himself, subtle yet undeniable. For years, he had prided himself on being unshakable, on knowing exactly who he was and what he stood for. But now he realized how much he didn't know and how much he wanted to learn. He got out of bed, stretching as he walked over to the window. Pulling back the curtains, he looked out at the city below. Los Angeles was waking up, its streets filling with cars and pedestrians moving toward their routines. From this height, everything seemed orderly, predictable even, yet he knew better. Beneath the surface, life was messy, complicated, and full of contradictions, just like him. After showering and getting dressed, he grabbed his phone and scrolled through his messages again. Her text still sat there, plain and simple. "Hope you made it out okay. Remember what we talked about. Keep asking questions." Those words stuck with him, not because they were profound or poetic, but because they felt real. They weren't trying to convince him of anything. They were simply an invitation to stay curious, to remain open, to embrace the unknown. He decided to write her back, unsure of what to say but feeling compelled to respond. "Good morning," he typed. "Your words have been stuck in my head since yesterday. I think I needed to hear them more than I realized." It only took a few minutes for her reply to come through. "Glad to hear it," she wrote. "Sometimes we need reminders that it's okay not to have all the answers. Keep exploring. You never know what you'll find." Her response made him smile. There was no pressure, no expectation, just encouragement. It struck him how rare that kind of interaction was in his life. Most conversations revolved around winning arguments or proving points. People often approached discussions as battles to be won rather than opportunities to connect. She was different. She listened without judgment, shared without agenda, and challenged without hostility. In doing so, she had created space for him to grow in ways he hadn't anticipated. Determined to carry that spirit forward, he spent the rest of the morning reflecting on his own habits. How many times had he dismissed someone's beliefs because they didn't align with his own? How often had he prioritized being right over truly understanding? These questions weighed heavily on him, not with guilt, but with clarity. He saw now that his skepticism, while valuable in some contexts, had also been a barrier, a shield that protected him from vulnerability, but isolated him from meaningful connection. Later that afternoon, he attended a panel discussion at a local conference center. The topic was unrelated to faith or belief systems. It focused on climate change and sustainable innovation. But as he listened to the speakers, he found himself paying attention differently. Instead of analyzing every argument for flaws, he tried to focus on the intent behind the words. What were these people trying to communicate? Why did they care so deeply about their work? And most importantly, how could he contribute to the conversation without needing to dominate it? During the Q&A session, he raised his hand, not to challenge anyone, but to ask a genuine question. It was a small act, almost insignificant, but it felt monumental to him. For once, he wasn't speaking to prove a point, he was seeking understanding. When the speaker responded, he nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the answer without immediately formulating a rebuttal. It was a new way of engaging, one that left him feeling both humbled and empowered. As the event wrapped up, he lingered near the exit, chatting briefly with a few attendees. One woman mentioned her nonprofit organization focused on environmental education in underserved communities. Another man talked about his efforts to bring clean water solutions to rural areas. Their passion was infectious, reminding him of the woman from the plane and her commitment to mentoring kids. These were people driven by purpose, not perfection. They weren't waiting for ideal conditions or foolproof plans. They were acting, serving, showing up where they were needed most. By the time he returned to his hotel, his mind was racing with ideas. He called his assistant and asked her to schedule a meeting with his team. I want to brainstorm ways we can use our platform to support grassroots organizations, he explained. Not just by talking about them, but by actually contributing resources and amplifying their voices. His assistant sounded surprised but enthusiastic. That sounds amazing, she said. When do you want to start? Tomorrow, he replied firmly. Let's make it happen. That evening, he sat on the balcony of his hotel room, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. He thought about the journey he'd been on since boarding that flight. It wasn't dramatic or earth-shattering, it was quiet, gradual, and deeply personal. A single conversation had sparked something inside him, nudging him to reconsider not just what he believed, but how he lived those beliefs. He pulled out his notebook again, flipping to a fresh page. At the top, he wrote 2 words: next steps. Below them, he began listing ideas, ways he could integrate empathy into his daily life, opportunities to collaborate with others, strategies for fostering connection instead of division. Each bullet point was a promise to himself, a commitment to keep growing, learning, and evolving. As darkness fell, he leaned back in his chair, letting the cool night air wash over him. The city lights twinkled below, a reminder of the countless lives intersecting in this sprawling metropolis. He thought about the woman from the plane, wondering if she ever realized the impact she'd had on him. Probably not, he mused. She likely went about her day, helping others and living her truth, without expecting anything in return. That selflessness inspired him, not to emulate her exactly, but to find his own path toward authenticity. Before heading inside, he sent her one last message. "Thank you again," he wrote. "You've given me a lot to think about. I hope our paths cross again someday." Her reply came quickly, as if she'd been waiting for it. "They will," she said. "Until then, take care of yourself and keep asking questions." He smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. Tomorrow would bring challenges, uncertainties, and plenty of hard work. But for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face them, not with arrogance or defensiveness, but with humility and hope. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let fear of the unknown hold him back anymore. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. The man threw himself into his new initiatives with a level of enthusiasm he hadn't felt in years. Meetings with his team turned into brainstorming sessions, where ideas flowed freely and no suggestion was dismissed outright. For the first time, he encouraged everyone to speak up, not just the loudest voices or the most confident personalities. He noticed how much richer the discussions became when people felt truly heard. One of the first projects they tackled was partnering with grassroots organizations working on education and mentorship programs for underserved communities. It wasn't about taking over or imposing their own agenda. It was about listening to what these groups needed and finding ways to support them effectively. Whether it was funding, resources, or simply amplifying their message through his platform, he made sure every decision came from a place of collaboration rather than control. At first, some members of his team were skeptical. They weren't used to seeing him so open-minded or willing to step back. "This isn't really our area of expertise," one of them said during a meeting. "Are we sure we're the right people to take this on?" He leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "That's exactly why we should do it," he replied. "We don't have all the answers, and that's okay. What we do have is the ability to learn, adapt, and make space for others who know better than we do. If we can help even a little, isn't it worth trying?" His words silenced the room for a moment before nods of agreement began to spread around the table. Slowly but surely, his team started to embrace this new approach. They reached out to community leaders, attended local events, and immersed themselves in understanding the challenges faced by those they aim to serve. It was humbling work, often messy and frustrating, but also incredibly rewarding. As the weeks went by, he found himself changing in small yet significant ways. He stopped reflexively arguing every point in conversations, instead choosing to listen more and speak less. He asked questions, real ones, not rhetorical traps designed to prove someone wrong. and he allowed himself to sit with discomfort, resisting the urge to rush toward certainty. It wasn't easy. There were moments when old habits crept back in, leaving him frustrated with himself. But each misstep became an opportunity to grow, to remind himself that progress wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, he sat alone in his office, staring at the city skyline outside his window. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him out of his thoughts. Picking it up, he saw a message from the woman he'd met on the plane. It had been weeks since their last exchange, and her timing felt almost serendipitous. "How's everything going?" she wrote. "Still asking questions?" He smiled, typing out a response. "More than ever," he replied. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, that faith is about connection. Turns out that applies to a lot more than I realized." Her reply came quickly. "Glad to hear it. Connection is powerful. It changes us, shapes us, reminds us we're part of something bigger." Her words resonated deeply, echoing the lessons he'd been learning firsthand. Over the past few weeks, he had discovered that connection wasn't just about building relationships. It was about creating bridges. Between ideas, between people, between worlds that seemed impossibly far apart. It required vulnerability, patience, and a willingness to let go of the need to always be right. The following week, he received an invitation to speak at a conference focused on social impact and innovation. Normally, he would have jumped at the chance to share his expertise, delivering a polished presentation filled with data and arguments. But this time, he decided to try something different. Instead of lecturing, he told a story, the story of a chance encounter on a plane that had changed the way he viewed the world. Standing on stage, he looked out at the audience, feeling unexpectedly nervous. Public speaking had never intimidated him before, but this felt raw, personal. As he began to recount the conversation with the woman wearing the cross, he noticed something remarkable happening. People leaned forward in their seats, their expressions shifting from polite interest to genuine curiosity. When he described how her calm demeanor and thoughtful responses had challenged his assumptions, he saw nods of recognition in the crowd, as if many of them had experienced similar moments of realization. By the time he finished, the room erupted into applause. But what struck him most wasn't the clapping or the standing ovation. It was the conversations that followed. Attendees approached him afterward, sharing their own stories of growth, doubt, and transformation. Some thanked him for reminding them of the importance of humility. Others admitted they had been stuck in rigid mindsets, afraid to step outside their comfort zones. Listening to them, he realized he wasn't alone in his journey. Everyone carried doubts, fears, and uncertainties, but those very things could become catalysts for change. In the months that followed, he continued to evolve. His public speaking shifted from debates to dialogues, from monologues to shared experiences. He partnered with organizations tackling issues he once thought were beyond his scope, from poverty alleviation to mental health advocacy. And while he still valued logic and evidence, he no longer dismissed emotions or intuition as irrelevant. He understood now that truth wasn't confined to facts. It lived in the spaces between hearts and minds. Eventually, life moved on. The memory of that flight faded into the background, becoming just another chapter in his ongoing story. Yet its impact remained, woven into the fabric of who he was becoming. He kept her number saved in his phone, occasionally sending updates about his progress. She responded warmly each time, cheering him on without judgment or expectation. One day, scrolling through photos on his laptop, he stumbled upon an image he had taken during that trip, a candid shot of the sunset from his hotel balcony. The colors were vibrant, streaked across the sky like brushstrokes on a canvas. Something about it reminded him of her, the quiet grace she carried, the light she brought to others' lives. He sent it to her with a simple caption, a reminder of where it all started. Her reply came a few minutes later. "Beautiful," she wrote. "Keep chasing sunsets." And so he did, not literally, of course, but in the choices he made, the connections he forged, and the questions he continued to ask. Life, he realized, wasn't about arriving at a destination. It was about embracing the journey, trusting that even in the absence of certainty there was beauty worth pursuing.